let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I started out my career as an engineer, actually. So I worked 15 or so years as an engineer. I was in hardware design. And, you know, in that capacity, I was on plenty of teams and um, I managed teams. And so I have a pretty good feel for what teams are in the real world. And I can tell you that, in my experience, it's similar to yours, that I actually can remember two teams that I would call were joyful. The rest were not necessarily completely painful, but they weren't what I would call joyful, the experience that I remember in those teams. I mean, in fact, one of those teams, I still, what is it, 15, 10 years later, I'm still in touch with the people in that team. So that's one indication of how you can know something is really joyful for you. Um, and I think part of that experience led me to want to study teams. And so I moved over into academia and I went for my doctorate. And as I was studying teams, I remember myself sitting in the library and I'm reading about teams and what makes an effective team. And after a while, it just drove me crazy. I was reading things that are certainly true. Effective teams, people trust each other, there's open communication, and all that kind of stuff. And the question I had was, how do I get that stuff? Where's the fairy dust that I can sprinkle on my team and get them to have trust and open communication? Um, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the myths about developing teams, at least from my perspective. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the principles for building your team, because there's a lot of wisdom there as well, which is not bad. It's just not all that practically helpful. Um, and it stems out of some of the beliefs in the myths about what it takes to develop a team. And then we will get into how you can take your power and how you can help nudge your team in a positive direction. And I call that, hey team, what's up with that? And you'll see why. So let's start with the myths. So this is probably the most important thing to understand. Um, the myth is that people are at the root of dysfunction. You're the problem, or you think I am the problem. And we start focusing on individuals. And what that leads to is a belief that the dysfunction in our team is driven by lack of skill or personality, or somehow we need to deal with the individuals. And I will tell you that one of the most amazing things as I started working with teams, and before Inspired Teams, which is the framework that this is based on, um, a colleague of mine and I, we did team emotional intelligence, and that was published in HBR a long, long time ago. And we were, we're working with that framework, which is incorporated into this. And just to give you a really, really quick example, some of the initial research we did was on cross-functional drug development teams at Johnson and Johnson, the same Johnson and Johnson developing that developed the third vaccine for COVID. And there was conflict in the teams. And hang on a second. That's, well, it'll go away. We'll just let that. That's unfortunately um, my Google Voice number ringing my phone. Um, so what happened was that there was conflict in these teams. And you would think that what they need is conflict resolution skills or, something like that, or understanding different styles, all these personal skill building things. And we worked with them with team emotional intelligence in that particular case. And it turns out that one of the norms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is around understanding your teammates. And once they realized that they needed to do that, they did things like have people come to their function to see what's going on. Or some of the teams had people give a little talk. And the most amazing thing is they had no conflict workshops or anything like that. We didn't do any of that. The most incredible part is that by working on that norm, the conflict disappeared. It just literally disappeared. And there's plenty of other cases. And so that was like one of the early foundational experiences that I had that really set me on this journey to understand and what's going on. Um, and so, as I said, we do a lot of skills training because we believe that it's the person. Um, the truth is that, and this is really important. It's complicated, but it's important. The truth is that culture pulls behavior. So, just to give you an example of what I mean by that, if you think of yourself in a baseball game and picture how you behave in a baseball game, you're probably cheering and yelling and screaming. You're in a certain culture, you're in a certain environment. Now, put yourself in a different environment. Put yourself in a library. You wouldn't act the same way. And if you do, the culture in that environment is going to come down on you and say, hey, wait a minute, quiet. Shh, this is a library, right? So the culture shapes your behavior. Now, what do I mean by the culture? It's the way we operate here. It's essentially the rules of interaction by which we behave. And how do you know those? How do you know what those are? You typically, if you enter a team or you go to a ball game or you kind of look around, you see what everybody else is doing, and you kind of discern what those rules are. And you might be saying, well, but I mean, there's no written rules. I mean, how are you supposed to know the rules? Well, that's a really important observation. There aren't written rules most of the time. They're implicit, okay? If you want to be an inspired team, you need to make those rules explicit. And fortunately, that that is possible to do. So you see the culture influencing these big blue arrows, influencing the interactions here among the team, right? But it goes the other way. It goes the other way too. What you do and what you say and the conversations you have as a team down here go up and start to create the culture. And so it's through the conversations and agreements that you make as a team, that you build the culture that then shapes your team and the behavior in your team. So keep that in mind because it's really at the heart of what we're going to talk about. So another myth is it's someone else's job, right? So you're in the team, and I know I sort of felt this way. I could sense something was wrong, right? And many of you could sense it, but you didn't say anything 30 to 50% of the time. We think it's the leader's responsibility. and that you need to stay quiet. You don't want to get yourself in trouble. And so you sit and suffer in silence. And the fact of the matter is, it really is everyone's responsibility. So you have the power to make a difference in your team, and you do that through the conversations that you initiate. And that's what we're going to talk about. And here's the thing to keep in mind. If you don't like the culture and you haven't initiated the conversation, you are complicit in the building of that culture. You have contributed to what your team culture is and the suffering that you're experiencing. Okay, that's really, really important. Okay, and the third myth I just want to talk about is we often think that it's going to take too much time and effort, that we need to take time away from work, right? And so the typical image is we have a team building workshop or we have a skills building workshop and we're taking the team away for hours and we're not getting work done. There's also a sense that if we do this, it's going to create tension. That tension is going to slow us down. And as a result, our performance is going to suffer. The reality is a culture is built while the team is doing its work. So think about the library example I gave you, right? So you go into the library and you start cheering like you're in a ball game. Somebody comes over to you and says, no, wait a minute, this is a library. You have to be quiet. That's an act that builds the culture. If nobody comes over to you and the screaming is allowed, and then the next person next to you starts screaming and nobody's saying anything, you are starting to build a new culture implicitly. So the culture happens in the behaviors while you're doing your work. Culture change is a big thing. And we often think that we need lots of force to make big change. That's really not true. If, as the saying goes, if you want to eat an elephant, you eat the elephant one bite at a time. You don't need big events. You can start one conversation at a time. And the other thing that happens when you do this, and it may seem counterintuitive, but I've seen it enough, is what happens is those conversations actually decrease tension, right? So you might experience this if you're in a relationship and you're having an argument. Well, if you don't ever talk about it, that tension always is there. If you're able to work it through and understand each other, all of a sudden the tension goes away and you can now continue with your relationship. It's the same with teams. And I think about it sort of like, a big wheel, like maybe a Ferris wheel, and there's a hub at the center. And, there's some friction. There's something holding that wheel back from spinning. And you want to make it go faster. And so you have a choice. You can go to the edge of the wheel and you can pull on it and tug on it and try and make it move. Or you could go to the center of the wheel and put some grease on it. A lot less effort, a lot easier to do, and it has a much bigger effect. And it reduces the stress of having to pull and all that stuff. And so having those little conversations that change the culture is like greasing the wheels. Okay, so now I want to just quickly talk about 3 principles, and then we're going to get into what you can do to take the power to move your team. So the first principle, don't chase mirages. And what I mean by that is, if you remember that diagram with the culture and the rules of interaction, you've got to understand those driving forces, those agreements, those norms, those rules of interaction, not what they're creating. okay? So conflict and lack of safety and all these other things are mirages for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they're mirages. They are the result of how people are interacting and the rules that guide those interactions. And so it's the culture you need to focus on because that's where the driving force is. And so the tip is don't assume that it's a team level problem. I mean, don't assume it's an individual problem. Assume it's a team level problem. And the first question to ask, no matter what it is what's the team's responsibility? And I'll give you a really, really quick example. There was, and this is a real example, there was a person who was coming to late to meetings. Nobody was saying anything. And so this person kept coming late to meetings. Now, you could deal with that in a lot of different ways, but if you take responsibility, so, you say, well, what's going on? Is there any way we can help? What you find is this person has to bring their kid to school in the morning, and the team meeting was at 9 o'clock in the morning. And if there was traffic, the person couldn't bring the kid to school and make the meeting. That is a much more productive way to go about solving the problem, assuming it's a team problem, rather than saying, look, Jose, you've got to come. Our meetings start at 9, and we really are counting on you to be here. So come at 9, right? A very different result. And it turns out that, in this team, they asked what was going on. And he said, oh, I was embarrassed to tell you, because I really want to be here and be a good team member. And, I didn't want to put my problems on the team. And so really well-meaning team and well-meaning team member, both trying to be supportive, can go down a rat hole because they're not sharing, and they're blaming each other if they do. Um, and so you focus on the rules of interaction and you start those conversations. Second, don't fly blind. And what I mean by this is you can read a ton of stuff and it acknowledges culture is key. But you know what? Try and find anywhere in there some very specific areas to pay attention to. It doesn't exist for the most part. So know where you should focus. And the Inspired Teams framework, based on a lot of research, has at least something that can help illuminate the landscape and focus your attention. It's not the be all end all, but I know it works. And each team adapts it to its own personality, but it helps you focus your attention. That's what it really does. Um, and it's the key leverage points for culture change. And so the tip is take your blindfold off. And this is the framework. In this particular talk, I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to give you a few ways that you can get more information on this at the end. You can sign up on my website. There's a um, newsletter that I'll send out to you that explains all this. And it turns out we're doing a webinar, a master class in a few weeks that I'll give you some information on. But essentially, this framework lays out the different norms that you need to focus on, or that when you focus on, produce the outcomes that you see there. And so the outcomes that you get as a team, energy, which is engagement or motivation, or however you want to talk, people are energized. It creates a joyful, passionate environment. That's what you see at the top is um, the emotions that are associated. You get innovation, you get execution, you get transparency. Um, and like I say, I'm not going to go into each of these in depth because I want to show you how you can actually take the power to influence your team. But you will have opportunity to learn more about that. And then the last principle here is elephants are big. And this is actually a really important principle. And so what it's trying to say is, if you picture that you are these blind men, basically sitting on different pieces of an elephant, you're all going to see a different thing. And you can see, one says it's a spear, another a fan, another a wall, right? Because they're all looking from their own history. What you need to do is you need to help people explore. If you want to find out what this big giant thing is that everybody's hanging on to, and you're sitting up there on the fan, well, you need to invite people to come and see what you see. And they need to invite you to come and see what they see. And eventually, if you have a conversation about it, you can get a better picture. And so the trick is you want to invite people into a conversation. And that's what the hate team is gonna do for you, is invite them into a conversation. So tip 3, take one bite at a time. Don't worry about this thing on the left. It's going to come up again. I'll show it to you. But these are basic questions in each of those outcome areas that you can focus on. And what you want to do is start a conversation, reinforce. You say, hey team, I noticed something, way to go. It's just a reinforcing type of thing. Or you can say, does anybody else feel that way, if it's a really good thing, right? And then if you want to, and by the way, reinforcing something that's good that's happening is probably more important than focusing on something bad that's happening. So, and if there's something you want to change, it's, hey team, I notice, and whatever it is, what's up with that? What's going on? And you just invite that conversation. Avoid judgment and stay curious. We'll talk more about that. So let's now move into the Haitian method. And let me just ask, are there any questions so far? Because I know I've gone through a lot here, but it's an important foundation.
No questions on the chat so far.
No questions. So I must be absolutely clear or totally not clear. Okay, so let's talk about these conversations, right? We saw that it's really in the conversations that you start to build those rules, that start to build your culture. And so the hate team conversation starts with an observation. We're going to go into more detail here, right? So you're observing something, and actually it actually starts with a sense. It's actually before that you have this observation, you're feeling something, you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling disengaged, you're feeling angry, right? You're sensing there's something wrong here, right? And so you try to make an observation about what that is. The framework gives you the leverage points, really where to focus. And it matters where you focus because the rules in the framework, we know, create those outcomes, okay? And then you invite a conversation. So here's the format. So you want to, get attention. So that's what the hate team is. And this is just really, you know, my sense of what gets attention. But if you don't feel comfortable with hey team, you can say whatever you choose that you feel comfortable with. You can start with, I notice, or you could start with, um, does anybody, I've got something that I've noticed. Would you like to hear it? Whatever you feel comfortable with. Don't be too wishy-washy. But you need to get some attention. You need to let them know you're about to say something important. Then you make the observation, I notice whatever. And that could be something that you notice around the norms, or it could be something that you're feeling. I notice I'm feeling angry. And it's just an observation, and we'll talk more about that. And then the invitation to the discussion, like, what's up with that? Or do you feel the same way? And that's all you're doing, is you are inviting people to get down off their piece of the elephant and come down and talk about what you both see. That is it. You're not going to change them. You're not going to convince them. You're not going to judge them. Okay, and we'll talk more about that, but that's really important. So here's some examples. Um, so if you're in the energy outcome, and you'll see on the right now, again, you see that these are a set of conversations that you can have. They're a set of questions. And this one happens to be um, in the energy, and it's the bottom one. How do we support each other to be our best set and whole selves? And so this is an observation you might make if you realize, and this is why the framework is important, because the framework will tell you appreciation is an important thing. I need to validate my team members. And you're noticing this isn't happening. Hey team, I notice we don't show appreciation for one another. What's up with that? That's all. That's all you do. And if the team doesn't take it up, it doesn't take it up. And I'll show you that in a second. One in the innovation. So this has to do with failure. So this is the second question: how do we react to failure? And you know that in a really inspired team, failure is expected. You're trying new things. You're bound to fail. Hey team, I feel great. We just celebrated a failure we learned from. Way to go. Do you feel the same way? That's a reinforcing thing, right? So, this might have happened just by accident, and you can reinforce that norm with this. So in execution, so this one is the last question over here. Okay, how do we ensure that we honor all team and individual promises? And you notice that people aren't keeping their promises. So you just make another observation. Hey team, I notice we aren't keeping our promises to one another. What's up with that? And you invite the discussion. And then transparency. And this is really the first two questions. You know, during a reflection, and the Agile teams do this really, really well. This is a strength of Agile. It's the retrospective, but I feel great. We just had a substantive discussion raising issues that are difficult to talk about. Way to go, right? So you got through some really tough conversation, and you just reinforce that. Okay, so why does this work? And then I'm going to show you some principles for generating the discussion. Why does it work? So this is the way I think about it. You start out, you're kind of sort of in the dark, right? Your team is floundering around. It knows something's wrong. People are sensing this, but there's no framework. There's no place for you to focus your attention. People don't know quite what to do other than call in the consultant and let's have a conflict skills workshop, right? So you start out that way. And then because you now have the framework and you know where to look and you know what to focus attention on, it's like putting night vision goggles on. You can now see something that you couldn't see before. And you have a way to talk about something that you kind of sensed was out of whack, but you didn't quite know how to bring it up. And then you share that with the team, right? So that's where you share your observation with the team. You help them start to be able to see. It could plop. This is, something to expect. You make an observation and the team just goes on its way and continues with whatever it's doing. That's okay. That's okay because you're sort of buzzing an idea into the team's head. My wife calls this the bzz theory. You just kind of bzz something. And what happens is it's germinating. You might notice it a couple of times. It might be that it takes 3 months before the team is in a place where they really can hear what you're saying. but it's there, it's germinating. So be patient. Hopefully, there's a quicker path, right? So you make your observation and it initiates a discussion. You say, hey, hey team, I notice we really haven't expressed appreciation. What's up with that? And the team can start a discussion. That's really true. We haven't done that. Maybe we should do something, right? And you start that discussion right there. And out of that discussion, you can come to some agreement, some way that the team is going to operate, some rule of interaction that you are now going to create. Okay, so yeah, we should make sure we at least once a meeting express our appreciation for a job well done, or whatever, however you want to implement it. That's the beauty too. It gets to be implemented in a way that each team is right for each team. And I just also want to point out as an aside here that I call these New Year's resolutions. So we always are making, and we have intentions to do something differently. And we go back to work and it never happens. There's a piece in the framework that helps you with that. It's called catalysts. And I won't get into it, but it's a really powerful way to actually make your New Year's resolution a reality. Um, so you have a discussion, and here's the power. Now, everybody in the team has agreed, yes, we need to do this. All the eyes are now upon it. And so when that behavior is being exhibited or not being exhibited, any team member, not just you, any team member can now make the observation, way to go, we just did what we said, or hey, wait a minute. And here's the other beauty. You can refer back to the agreement. Didn't we agree that we were going to, once a meeting, express appreciation? Why isn't that? Why didn't we do that this time? Or I noticed we didn't do that this time. You don't want to ask question why. I noticed we didn't do that this time. What's up with that? Right? And that's the power of an inspired team, is that you've now got these agreements that everybody's uh, focused on. And the fact that you've used the framework focuses you on areas that really, really matter. Okay. I mean, because ground rules is a whole nother conversation that drives me crazy. It's those ground rules at the beginning of a meeting where everybody says, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And that's about what they do with it. Anyway, this really makes it happen and turns it into reality. Okay, so I'm going to end here with some principles for constructing these observations. And I want to say that it's not as easy as it might look. And I'll get to that in the last principle, but this isn't easy. And I often have to, I write something, I go, no, that's not the best way I could say it. Just like I just did just a couple of seconds ago, right? I ended with, well, why aren't we doing that? That's not the best way. Just a what's up with that, right? Not asking, the question is judgmental, okay? So facts only, and this is hard. This is so hard. People are interpretation machines. We don't even realize when we are making interpretations and assessments and judgments. And so you want to stick to what you can see or hear. You don't want to put any, judgment in there. You don't want to put anything you have to interpret as an observation. So, hey team, I notice we don't seem to care about Joe's perspective. What's up with that? Now, what's wrong with that? Right? That's an observation. I notice we don't seem to care. It's not a fact, it's an assessment. Your assessment is that we don't care. What did you observe? I notice we do not have Joe's perspective and we didn't ask for it. That's the fact. It's an assessment that that fact means we don't care about his perspective. And when you make that judgment, all you do is stir up people, you trigger people. You can't have a useful discussion around that because people are going to say, what do you mean we don't care? Of course we care. And you're going to just trigger that and go down a rat hole. Talk about the fact, and you get a much more productive discussion. Second one, this goes back to what I said about ask about how the team is contributing. Focus on the team's behavior, not the individuals. Now, I want to say that I know there are some bad apples. It's not nearly as many as we think there are, like maybe 5%, 10%. I haven't come across really bad apples. Okay, people are mostly trying to do a good job. So focus on the team. So here's an example. Hey team, Joe has been quiet and we have not asked for his perspective. What's up with that? If you focus on, yeah, so here you're focusing on Joe, right? Joe has been quiet. Joe is going to get defensive about that, right? And Joe is probably thinking, well, of course I've been quiet because Susan's talking all the time. If she wasn't talking all right, and this is all going on in people's head. So if you focus on the team, I notice we don't have Joe's perspective and we haven't asked for it. Now you focus on the team. Oh, why haven't we gotten it? Well, maybe it's because Joe doesn't care. Maybe it's because Sue's talking all the time. Who knows why? But now you can have a conversation about it without triggering people. And here's another trick. And this trick helps you with the first one, stick with facts only. Get rid of adjectives. It works beautifully. Some adjectives really are descriptive, like red, okay? But many are more assessments. So light blue is not an adjective that you would use because light blue is an assessment, okay? Red you could use, but even that I won't go into, but doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, especially colorblind people. So get rid of adjectives. I notice we seem to be afraid of making our performance information visible. Now you guys are agile teams, so you don't fear that, but a lot of teams do. Afraid, that's an assessment, that's an adjective, right? To be afraid, that's an adjective. Get rid of it. Okay. I notice we are not posting performance information. What's up with that? That is the fact. You don't have to put the afraid adjective into that observation. This is a tricky one here. Own your feelings. So let me just quickly say what I mean by that. We as humans get triggered very easily. And when somebody triggers us, we tend to make a statement, something to the effect, you made me angry. You made me, okay? Or something to that effect. Owning your feelings means what you are going to state is what you feel, not any assessment about what triggered it or anything. So saying I'm feeling unheard because Joe is talking too much is blaming your feeling of being unheard on Joe. Get rid of that blame, that putting your feeling on somebody else. So, hey team, I feel unheard. Does anyone else feel that way? Period. Now you can have a conversation. Well, why do you feel unheard? What's going on? Yeah, I noticed we haven't had, and the team can have a productive discussion. Or another way to put it, hey team, I'm having a hard time getting my perspective heard. Does anyone else feel that way? Own your feelings. And then the last one here is be supportive. So this is this is similar to focus on the team's behavior. How are we contributing? So an example here, I notice Joe is sometimes late to meetings and nobody says anything. That's okay, because that is an observation. You, Joe is late to meetings, nobody says anything. And that will work actually. Better is if you can be supportive, put it on the team basically. So I noticed you were late to 3 of the last 5 meetings. Is everything okay? Try to understand what's going on. Don't assume it's the person. Assume that the team can help in some way. Okay. And the last principle, this is probably the most important one, is take your time. If you see it at a meeting, it's going to happen at another meeting. You don't need to make the observation right there. Go home, sit on it, craft your observation, put it up against these principles, see whether it's an assessment or just a fact and an observation. Are there any adjectives in it? Is there any way to make it more supportive, etc., etc.? And I will tell you that it's a critical step, because even I have to do that, because the first one I come up with is not um, always the best way to phrase things. Um, the other is know where you're coming from. And so if it doesn't feel right to you, don't do it. And the reason I say that is it won't feel right to you if you're being judgmental, if you're making an assessment, if you feel you're being critical. It's not going to feel right. Sit down and figure out where you're coming from. Why are you making this observation? What are you trying to accomplish with it? And get to a point where it's just an observation and you can feel perfectly comfortable about stating a fact. It will not bother you. Okay. Um, and finally, there's lots of observations that you can make. And you want to focus on the key leverage points. And so use the framework or some other framework. It doesn't have to be inspired teams, but focus on the things that you know matter to the culture that will make your team highly productive. And the beauty of this method is you can do it as an individual, but it gets multiplied if the whole team understands this, so that when they hear "Hey team," their ears perk up, right? They know the method, anybody can do it, and they're listening for the observations and they know that they want to have a discussion. It just will magnify the ability to make a change and make it go a lot faster. So just to quickly wrap up, and then we have like 4 or 5 minutes for questions. Um, the truth, dysfunction is a team issue. You do have the power. It takes short but consistent efforts. And the tips focus on the culture, focus on the key leverage points that we know matter for culture. And they're not always obvious. They're not always obvious. Um, but you've got a framework that will help show you what they are. Make fact-based assessments and then initiate a conversation. That's how cultures get built. It's through the conversation and the agreements that people make that builds the culture. And take your time. Make sure that you've thought about how you're going to phrase your observation. Make sure you know where you're coming from when you make that observation.